Forgive us for starting a few minutes late. We wanted to make sure we had everybody that we knew was coming. But we're all here now for our Safe Communities Committee meeting on March 2nd. And we will start with introductions and then jump right in. I am Larkin Eggleston, committee chair. We'll do committee members first, and then folks in the room here with me, and then folks who are joining us online. Ms. Ajmera?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Dimple Ajmera, committee member and at-large council member. Thank you.
Renee Johnson, committee member, District 4.
Victoria Watlington, District 3.
Greg Phipps, committee member at large.
Braxton Winston, serving at large.
Starting on my left in the room, Federico Rios, Office of Equity, Mobility, and Immigrant Integration.
Victoria Johnson, Assistant City Manager for City Manager's Office.
Ashley Chasso, Charlotte Communication.
And other guests joining us online in whatever order you want to jump in there.
Deputy Chief Stella Patterson, CMPD.
I'm not sure. I think everybody else is on for support staff there. So appreciate everybody being with us and all the folks who are watching along. I will note to all of my council colleagues that you have gotten in your packet that was emailed to you yesterday, and I think an updated version today, some details on the crime reduction unit and corridors of opportunity, questions that have been asked, as well as the Family Justice Center now going by the name the Umbrella Center. That presentation last month had led to a lot of questions from the council, and those you have received responses to. Those responses have come from a subcommittee of that organization had responded to our questions. Staff is still doing work to bring it back to this committee with their analysis of the plan and the ask and the impact it can have on the efforts that we've got ongoing to addressing violent crime in our community. So please take a look at that as time allows. The main thing, we'll get Ms. Johnson to dive in. Actually, if you want to jump in first, and then I'll frame our conversation for part two before we turn it over to the deputy chief.
Okay. So our agenda for the day is for the CMPD search warrant policy update. CMPD is working with Campaign Zero once again. Previously worked with them on the 8 can't wait policy changes to examine search warrant policy language and determine appropriate and necessary changes to potentially align with Campaign Zero's objective. And doing that presentation will be Deputy Chief Stella Patterson.
And I want, before Chief Patterson starts, I want to thank Councilmember Winston. Councilmember Winston brought this topic, this issue, to my attention a couple of months ago. He and I had conversations with Chief Jennings. Chief Jennings was more than willing to tackle this and figure out where we can strengthen the language and clarify the language in our policies to better align with what are deemed to be best practices in this area. So I know Chief Jennings couldn't be with us today, but I'm greatly appreciative of his continued willingness to be a partner with the City Council as we try to continuously improve our department. And thanks again to Councilmember Winston for bringing this to our attention and giving us the opportunity to have this conversation. So Chief Patterson, take it away.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Mr. Chair, Madam Manager. Good afternoon to everyone. As you stated, I do want to give a progress update on where we are with our work with the 8 Can't Wait and this Campaign Zero folks. In terms of an overview of what we're going to be discussing today, next slide, please. Just want to kind of give you high level our purpose in doing this work, also provide a definition to you, a legal definition for search warrants, talk a little bit about the criteria and the legislation that Campaign Zero is looking at, as well as their recommendations. Also want to talk about some of the concerns that we see or that we have faced, some of the research that we've done, also some of the successes, and then of course answer any questions that you may have related to the work. So with respect to purpose, of course, CMPD, we're always looking at ways. I think Councilman Exton, you said it great, that we're looking at ways to strengthen our policies, looking at ways to do business better overall, looking at whatever those best practices are. But I think really as an organization, we want to make sure that our community is safe. We want to make sure that the interactions that we're having with the public are good interactions. And so reviewing our search warrant policies and looking at the recommendations from Campaign Zero is really a win-win for everybody all the way around. Now, Campaign Zero, as you stated, they led the initiative with the 8 Can't Wait, which CMPD was one of only a few agencies across the nation that was able to meet all those recommendations for that. We're very proud of that because our policies were already reflective of many of those reform efforts. So with that now, of course, though, they're looking more closely at search warrants and some of their recommendations that they have around that. Next slide. By way of definition, North Carolina General Statute is very clear, has a lot of regulation around search warrants and search and seizures in general, which is very good for our state, that those definitions are defined and that the rules around search and seizures are outlined. North Carolina General Statute 15A 220 to 259 or so really itemizes and lists what those various things are. But by way of definition, a search warrant, very simply, is just a written order by a magistrate or a judicial official or other authority, a judicial authority, really directing law enforcement to search specific locations, property, or persons. We have different kinds of search warrants that we seek and that we serve at CMPD. Our general one is just a general search warrant in the definition that I gave you, but also to administrative search warrants. And those warrants differ in that they are not to seize property necessarily. Those warrants are more administrative in nature. When we are looking perhaps at a nuisance location or nuisance action, we would seek an administrative search warrant that would allow then to see if the business is following code. Fire department would usually accompany us when we do that, or the business itself would have that warrant for that inspection. So those are the kind of two types of search warrants that we usually have available to us. Some of our search warrants as well are for blood. You have to get, if you want to get blood or DNA from a subject, you're going to have to get a search warrant for that. Next slide. We wanted to provide just a little bit of context around the number of search warrants that we serve at CMPD. So we have numbers here for you from 2019 and also from 2020. 2019, 401 that we sought and served, 2020, 398. I want to make it very clear, I think it's important to note that when you look at this number of these 799 search warrants that we sought, we're not talking search warrants where we made what's called a dynamic entry, meaning we didn't deploy a flashbang, we didn't ram a door, we didn't force our way into a residence. Those types of search warrants, those dynamic search warrants, are few in number. The majority of our search warrants that we serve are ones where our officers go to a call for service where there's victimization. We see somebody shot, that person's incapacitated, or they don't reside at that residence, and we see evidence of a crime at that residence. We don't have the authority just to go throughout the house and just search. At that point, we would have to secure that residence, go then to the magistrate's office, secure a search warrant, and then come back to be able to search. The majority of our search warrants fall into that category, and I think it's really important that we note that. In terms of crime types, we wanted to provide you to help you to see that the majority of our search warrants are linked to a crime, and when I say a crime, either a violent crime or a property crime like an LFA, something that is continually occurring in the community, or drug transactions or drug activity. You can see there in 2019, 28% of the search warrants that we served tied back to violent crime, to sexual assaults. In 2020, 144 of those were. Other types of search warrants that's not listed on this chart that I do want to specify is like traffic stops. So we have a DWI checkpoint, or we stop somebody for DWI, and we have to obtain blood in order to get evidence. We would then get a search warrant for that purpose. So there are different reasons why. Also, too, a DNA. We need to get DNA, a buccal swab from someone. We would have to seek a search warrant for that purpose as well. I thought that it would be beneficial just to be able to see the times that we typically serve these warrants. We have it broken down into two categories here for you, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. That's the bulk of the warrants. 57% for 2020 were served during those hours. From 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., 42% of the warrants that we served was during those hours. And I'll talk a little bit about this later, but during those times, again, is the scenario that I just presented to you. Those early morning violent crime incidents, because that's when typically the violent crime occurs. Those are those warrants that we get during those hours after dark because there's an exigency there and we need to obtain evidence fairly quickly. Next slide. So in working with Campaign Zero, of course, they're looking to change some of the search warrant requirements at the legislative level. And it's good that they start there because I told you at the beginning of this presentation that the majority, that there's a lot of legislation and regulation around search warrants. So to make the changes, you really have to go to the state level or to the federal level in order to see those actual changes. I think they have recognized that, and that's why they are starting there. We recognize that looking at our internal policies, that as a police agency, we can't change the legislation. There's some things that we just are really bound by law that we just cannot change. So being realistic then, we know that there's a point system that Campaign Zero is looking at for meeting all the requirements that they're asking. The best possible score for that is a 15. Currently, we are at 6, and I'll kind of explain to you why we are there. Next slide, please. Next slide. So these are the recommendations that Campaign Zero is researching and looking at in terms of search warrants. I won't go over all of them, but just kind of on a high level, look at some of them. The ban on no-knock warrants, the nighttime raids. I just told you that, we're kind of split. 50% of our warrants are during daytime hours, but Campaign Zero doesn't want any nighttime search warrants. They recommend the search warrants only be conducted or served from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. Also to additional application requirements for exigent circumstances. There's a lot of discussion around what exigency is, and they're looking at that. Also, too, they want to make sure that our officers are clearly recognizable and identifiable as law enforcement officials being in uniform. They want warrants to be executed within a 72-hour time frame. Next slide. They also want warrants to be voided if they're not executed within 7 days of issuance. I'll talk more about that. They want officers to be able to provide surveillance or do surveillance on a property within 24 hours prior to serving the warrant. Also, too, they want officers to be equipped with body cameras and other video devices. They are looking at property. They want to ensure that property cannot be seized unless an individual is arrested. There's, again, a lot of conversation around exigency circumstances. They advocate no flashbangs or distractionary devices to be utilized. Next slide. Additionally, they want to ensure that there's announcement and verbal identification of the law enforcement officer who is doing the entry into the residence. They want a minimum of 30 seconds for occupants to respond before opening the door or before entering the residence. They want that any evidence that is obtained that is a violation of their policies will not be admissible in court for prosecution. And then also, too, they want to ensure that there's some consequence when officers violate the requirements. They want restitution to be paid if we damage property or destroy property. And lastly, an independent review or an oversight board to look at search warrants and to review also the footage for when officers enter a residence. So a lot of recommendations. They have given us credit for some things that we are already doing. In September of 2020, the ban on no-knock warrants. Also, too, our officers are always in uniform when they execute warrants. That's in our policy, and I'll talk more extensively about that. So we've received full credit for a couple things, partial credit for some others. The concern, of course, to us is where we have not received any credit. And in those, and I want to talk a little bit more about those because there are some concerns about some of the recommendations that they have made. So let's start with looking at the ones they have not given us credit for. Next slide, please. Next slide. The first one I want to talk about is the wait time. Of course, they are asking, Campaign Zero is advocating that there be a 30-second wait time before entering the residence. The law currently states that an officer can make a forcible entry after knocking and announcing. I think that is the key, after knocking and announcing, and when they reasonably believe that admittance is being denied or unreasonably delayed. So there is no firm law that indicates that you have to wait a certain amount of time. From us, from a CMPD perspective and from a law enforcement perspective across the spectrum, other states beyond North Carolina, the concern, of course, in this is safety. And safety is our number one thing, both for our personnel as well as for citizens. If you institute a 30-second wait time, if you will, we never know who's on the other side of that door. We do our best to do risk assessments, we do threat assessments before we serve a search warrant, but still you don't know exactly who is going to be in that residence. For the safety of our personnel as well as those who might be in the residence, 30 seconds is ample time to load a weapon, it's ample time to charge an officer as they're coming through that door. So this is not one that we would recommend that we would move forward. I think the law is very clear that you have to knock and you have to announce. And knocking, you're letting someone know you're at the door. Announcing, you're announcing that you are a police officer, you're a law enforcement person, and that gives the person notice for the officers then to go through the door. All right, next slide, please. The other concern we have is with flashbang, the prohibition of flashbang devices, distractionary devices. The requested policies that officers shall not use flashbang, stun gun, distraction, or other similar devices unless verifiable exigent circumstances exist. Our policy currently is that we do not use any diversionary devices unless it is a life-threatening situation. In fact, the only people in our police department that's trained in using diversionary devices is our SWAT team, and we know that they are highly trained in order to use this. When we look back at the number of times that we have used any kind of distractionary devices, the number is very small. In 2019, our SWAT team served 9 warrants. In 2020, they served 11, and year-to-date, they've only served once. And of those, every time they didn't use like a flashbang. So, but we don't want to take away the ability to use that, because from experience, I have supervised search warrants, I have been on search warrants. I know from experience that there are those times when you are dealing with individuals who are so combative, individuals where it's a high risk kind of warrant. You need to be able to have those devices to use to make sure that if the situation is going awry or is the potential to go awry, that you have some devices to distract that individual. Again, only our highly trained personnel use those. They use them safely. We have not had an incident at CMPD where a distraction device, has been used in a capacity where somebody has been injured, killed, or harmed seriously. Next slide, please. The other concern that we have is the time of day for the service of warrants. The requested policy is that warrants be served between 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. unless there's reasonable cause to believe that it cannot be executed during those hours. CMPD policy, again, is in line with the law. There is no parameters around the time in which a search warrant should be served. For us, I showed you the numbers. Most of them are during the day. We don't have a problem. We like serving warrants during the day because you can see it's advantageous for us. But we want to be able to have the ability to serve warrants whenever they are needed, not just a set time. I'll tell you, just the other day in the Hickory Grove division off of Albemarle Road on Sunday night, we had an incident where there was a shooting. Our officers observed an individual run into a residence. When they got there on the scene, somebody who fit the description of the suspect run into a residence. They then knew that they would have to get a search warrant. When they went to get consent to go into the residence, the resident would not let them in. And so based on that, they made the decision to go get a search warrant. In getting that search warrant, it was like 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. If we were to follow this recommendation, we would probably have to wait a couple hours, wait till daytime or so to execute that warrant. So we just need to be able to have that flexibility just across the spectrum to be able to serve warrants as the time is needed or whenever it is needed. Next slide, please. The consequence of the officer's action. So the requested policy here is that officers in violation of the warrant requirements shall be subject to consequences, included but not limited to rendering all evidence collected admissible, or suspension of duties, fines, termination for violating warrant requirements. So this is problematic for us, particularly for evidence being rendered inadmissible. When we serve warrants, any evidence that's collected as a result of that then becomes part of the case. We do not have the authority as a police agency to be able to say that that evidence now is inadmissible. That is in the district attorney's hands. It's at their discretion in order to do that. Also, too, if it's determined at some point that the warrant was not valid on its face, that the evidence was obtained in any illegal manner, then you also have a second layer of that case going to a judge and making that determination of whether the evidence should be inadmissible. That is not something that we can do from our level, that those are levels above us. And I think that Campaign Zero has recognized that, and so they're looking to really remove this requirement from their rubric because they see that that is out of the hands of law enforcement themselves. All right, next slide. So those are the main concerns that we see with these policies. There are some others, and Chief Jennings is going to give you a full report once we do a complete review of everything. But I thought it would be prudent for us just to talk about some of the successes as well. We're very pleased to be able to let you know that we immediately, last year after the Breonna Taylor incident, we recognized as an organization that no-knock warrants are not safe, that they're not a good alternative. In fact, at CMPD, I can't tell you the last time, I don't know of any instance in the 24 years that I've been here that we've done a no-knock warrant. So we immediately changed our policies to reflect that we will not we will not seek or serve no-knock warrants, not only in our jurisdiction, but if other task force officers or such have a no-knock warrant, we will not be a part of the service of that warrant. Also, in respect to uniform identification for all police officers, we have it in our policies that officers must be either in uniform, in full uniform that identifies them as a police officer. There are instances when our cybercrime unit, financial crime unit, they are in plain clothes, they can serve a warrant, but they must have clothing that clearly identifies them as a police officer. They have to, on their tactical vests, have to say police across the front, on the back. We're very clear in making sure that that occurs. It's already in policy. Also, the knock and announce requirement prior to executing a warrant, that is the law. We follow the law. And we make an intentional effort when we train. When I went to high-risk warrant school, they trained us. You should announce police so loudly that 3 houses down, they hear that the police is at the door trying to enter that residence. So we're very keen about making sure that we knock and announce before going into a residence. And then one final success we've had is just with our body-worn camera. Again, we have it in our policies that officers must have their cameras on. They must be powered on. They must be running when they enter and recording any structure. They must also take photographs. Supervisors have to take photographs of the residents when they first enter and then after the search. And that is part of the investigative sergeant's report that they must have anytime that we served and execute a warrant. All right. So I did cover a lot with you, but I'm open to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Chief. I've got a couple, and I know I see at least one hand up already with some additional ones. For the statistics, if we can go back to the slide that showed year-over-year warrants and, wow, that was quick. All right. Do we track in those statistics how many of our warrants out of the total are what we would consider dynamic warrants?
We do, Mr. Chair, we do track those numbers. It's more of a manual process, though, and I wasn't able to break it out completely for you today because of that. but we do track what those are. I gave you the search warrant numbers for our SWAT team, which they keep, but there's just one more layer for them to put in to be able to say, you know, which one they actually used like a flashbang and when they didn't.
Okay, so that, are our SWAT team the only ones executing dynamic warrants, or sometimes are officers outside of that specialized team doing those as well?
Yes. Our officers outside of that specialized team are trained also in serving dynamic warrants. They're not trained to deploy flashbangs or distractionary devices, but they can do a dynamic entry, meaning that they knock and announce, and then they take a ram and they go through the door. That would be considered a dynamic entry.
I think for the purposes of us having as much information as we can to sort of analyze where there's opportunities to improve, that might be a statistic that could be easily documented, at least going forward, if it's not been explicitly in the past. Because I think much of what prompted this conversation is based on occurrences that involve dynamic warrants, being executed in the middle of the night while people are asleep. And for us to know whether there's any issue there with or not in our own department, I think those statistics would be important. So number of dynamic warrants of the total, and then maybe within that number of dynamic warrants executed between, you know, whatever period of time, 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., I think would be useful information for me. One other, well, I don't know if you have anything else on that, I'll let you do it
No.
before I go to the next thing.
Yeah, no, we will work on getting that for you. We've made some notes on it, so we'll extract that information and have exact numbers on that.
The call that Councilmember Winston and I had with some of the folks from Campaign Zero, I recall one of the things about, and I do think this is, the intent is in our policy, but I think the question in the conversation we were having was, is it clear enough in the language of our policy around the clearly identified as a police officer? Because there was something in our policy that said officers will either be in uniform or in, and I'll get the exact wording wrong, but something like tactical team apparel or tactical team gear or something, and it didn't explicitly say which will also clearly identify them as a law enforcement officer.
Yeah, so, yeah, Mr. Chair, our policy, our CMPD policy states that they have to have clearly identifying markings on their uniform that they are a police officer. So really two scenarios. One, you can be in uniform like how I am in uniform with patches that identify you as a police officer. But if you happen to be in a tactical uniform or something else, we have to have something that has to say police on it. And really that came out of 2016, the shooting we had with Keith Lamont Scott, where our officers were not clearly identified as police officers. So we made the change there to say that it has to be evident that the person is a police officer. And of course, by doing that, you have to have something that says police on it.
So there's no longer any ambiguity in the language around that piece.
No, there should not be. There is up to interpretation, but I'm actually trying to get the exact wording for you. I have the policy here. I just need to find where it says it, and I can get back to it. If you want to go to your next question, I can come back to it. I have it here. I just need to find it.
And that's fine. That can be part of a follow-up as well. I know before I keep going, I know Mr. Phipps has had his hand up for a while, so I've got him and then Councilmember Winston.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I do have it here. If I can just read it to you.
Yep.
So in our policy, it states that for search attire, officers must be wearing a bulletproof vest, police duty gear, handcuffs, flash, and a gun. If not in uniform, the outermost garment must be immediately recognizable as being a sworn police officer. So that's our language, and our practice is to have clothing that says police across the front or police across the back of it.
Heard. Thank you. Councilmember Phipps.
Yeah, for some reason I lost connectivity when we were talking about the dynamic warrants. So what I want to get a better feel for, are you saying then that the dynamic warrants are predispositioned that way when they're issued, or is it situational once you get on site?
It can be both, but typically, those are predetermined search warrants based on the intelligence or the information that is gathered before you get even to the residence, that we would make a dynamic entry. We typically don't make a dynamic entry if we're already there, kind of thing. So if we go for a call for service and the officers are already on scene, there's no need then to make a dynamic entry. They're already inside the residence, so there's no need for that. But for instance, if we're serving a drug warrant, we would do intelligence and get information on that residence beforehand, and then we would typically make a dynamic entry into that residence. We know those kind of warrants are high risk in the sense that drugs and guns usually go together. So we would want to make sure that we make a very tactical entry or a dynamic entry into that residence for that reason.
So in your experience, has CMPD ever had any dynamic warrants that once you got on site, you didn't have to use that type of entry?
Just kind of thinking through it. No, there have been instances where you get there and maybe the information changes or what you see changes. There's more cars there than what you thought before. So there's obviously more people in the residence, and for a safety concern, now you say, okay, well, we're going to, what we call line up in a stack, and we're going to do a dynamic entry rather than just going simply and knocking on the door. You might need to make a dynamic entry. So yeah, there's been instances, I'm sure, where that has occurred.
And my final question is, so an undercover police officer couldn't serve a search warrant?
An undercover police officer?
Yeah,
we would,
plainclothesman, I mean, undercover, incognito, he would have to have some sort of identifying markings that he's a police officer.
correct, yes, sir. He would have to have identifying clothing, markings, a badge, shield, something that makes that person immediately recognizable as a police officer.
Thank you.
Chief, I might have misheard Councilmember Phipps. I thought he was asking the inverse of the question you answered, which was, are there ever dynamic entry warrants where you roll up and the situation's changed and you find that you don't have to use that tactic but can actually step down to more of a
less tactical.
whatever the opposite of dynamic entry is?
Yes, a less tactical approach. Yes, sir. Thank you for clarifying that. That is actually an excellent question. Yes, very much so. There are instances when you go and as you're either getting ready to approach the residence or you're driving up, individuals come out with their hands up or they open the door and let you in. We don't have to do a dynamic entry in those types of situations at all. In fact, we prefer those kinds of warrants or kind of situations. In fact, I will also tell you, we really don't like necessarily for individuals to be in the residence because that can create harm or a harmful encounter. Without telling too much, we like for the person to be leaving the residence, and we make a stop of them, a traffic stop, and then we take them back to the residence and we serve the warrant then. That is the safest way for all parties involved.
And one other thing that Mr. Phipps prompted me to think about, and this might just be food for thought, but I don't know how you'd codify this and get the language right, but I'm sure we could figure out a way. Clearly, there is a difference between an active situation where you've received a call for service at 2 a.m. and it leads to a need to search a residence. I guess, thinking out loud, I'm wondering if there is a way that in our policies we could identify that difference and say, if we receive a warrant that is not attached to an active situation, but could be executed anytime in that 2 or 3 day period thereafter, or whatever our goal is for how quickly we execute once we receive a warrant, that if it's more of that less active situation, then we would have a policy that stated that it would be served during the daytime, as opposed to just arbitrarily picking to do it at 3 a.m. to catch someone off guard. So if you want to respond to that, you can, but it's just me thinking out loud in terms of how do we delineate between those active situations versus the ones where we have more flexibility and choice in when we execute it?
Right. So I think the challenge would end up being is exactly what you're saying, how you delineate. Because when you talk about search warrants, when you talk about the world of policing, period, things are rapidly evolving and changing all the time. So where a situation may seem calm at the moment, within 15 seconds, 20 seconds, it can be escalated to something greater. So, and being able to quantify that is going to be difficult. I think the better approach is to just have the flexibility to be able to say, as those situations change, and if you have to adjust to them, you do that, and have the ability to serve those warrants anytime based on situation, kind of thing. It is.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead. It's just stating that, in my experience, it's not our goal really to serve warrants at 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. That's not what we seek to do. Early morning, typically when people are just waking up, is probably the best time because they're less combative, they're less agitated, that kind of thing. So I don't see it, and I'm going to get those numbers to you. We're going to break them out to you. I think you're going to find that really the majority of our warrants are early morning through the day type of thing, and not the 3 and 4 o'clock in the mornings. Those are the warrants where we get to the call and a crime has occurred and we need to secure the evidence, and so we go get the warrant for that purpose.
And it might be as simple as just making sure that we have a policy that there is a documented and stated reason for the need to do middle of the night execution of that warrant. But Mr. Winston has got his hand up next.
Thank you. Two questions or comments. Thank you, Chief and CMPD, for taking this up. I will say, as Mr. Eggleston said, Campaign Zero reached out to me. I reached out to Mr. Eggleston. He was right on it. We reached out to Chief Jennings, and Chief Jennings was right on it. Might I suggest that, especially being that, as Chief Patterson said, that this work is ongoing, that it might be appropriate to bring this topic and reconvene that stakeholders group that was working with this Safe Charlotte framework to meet with Project Zero, CMPD, and folks from the committee to kind of, do what we're doing here. And so, we can get some community feedback. I thought that those processes worked out really well. Also, especially because, as folks know, might or might not know, City Council is not directly, does not get to directly influence departmental policy. This is really about the municipal services and how and the relationship between the departments, right? Whether this is CMPD, Charlotte Water, or Solid Waste, and how they serve the community. So I think that this is really important to have that. So I hope, Mr. Eggleston, you will consider that step. The other question I have is something I saw in the beginning slides about repairing damage to property when search warrants are executed.
The recommendations from Campaign Zero? I think
Yeah. And I think CMPD and I think us from City Council should give this some deep thought. When these warrants are executed, wherever you stand on, on the issue, I think we should all agree that there's real trauma involved in this, real property damage, and in many situations, psychological things that make us that folks that this is served on, either rightfully or wrongly, the direct person that this warrant is served on, or as Chief Patterson kind of alluded to, the family members or friends that might be caught up in collateral damage, literally and figuratively. We had a situation like this over the summer, that got a lot of press, but I've also been very intimately involved with a particular family since even before I was elected. Tim Davis was a young man who came into an encounter with CMPD and ended up dead. He ended up dead in his home. We ended up entering that house using a robot, and there was significant damage done. Right after that was cleaned up, I went into that room, and I was with Tim's mother as she was cleaning up blood and brains from the carpet and the walls. There just before the pandemic, because she is still struggling with this. She has not fixed the damage. We are not going to fix her damage to her door and to her garage that was caused when when we sent the robot in to see what was going on. It is not within our policy, and we do have a service, an outside service that we recommend to our community members should damage occur, like the Davis's experience. But really, it's when you're dealing with this, you see how inhumane this policy really is. I think that I hope from a city council perspective, this might be a budgetary issue. Is there a fund that we can pull from that we can go to try to bring community members back into our community and not continue to isolate them from whatever trauma that is caused by executing these search warrants? This is real, and this creates real hindrances to our abilities to have healthy relationships between constituents and their government. So I hope I know I said a mouthful there, but I hope staff heard me, and I hope that this is something that we can talk about during the budget process, and I hope it's something that CMPD will consider on their own of updating their policies there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winston. Chief?
Yes, I wanted to say one thing to respond to what Councilman Winston's just stated. So we're looking really to incorporate into our policy that we would connect with risk management, because that would be the entity then that would ensure restitution or make sure that the damages that may have caused from the search warrant will be handled. So that is something that, we're looking to write into policy anyway, that there will be full consultation with risk management to ensure that there is some kind of restitution.
Thank you, Chief. One other thing, when you're bringing back to us the information that breaks down the warrants that have been executed, dynamic versus not, could we also get, I assume the data is available because there would undoubtedly be some sort of timestamp, could we get a breakdown that's maybe a little bit more nuanced than 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. in 2 or 3 hour increments, so we could have a better sense of the time that the majority of warrants are executed than just in 2 12-hour periods?
Yes, sir. We do have that information. We will get that.
That'd be great. Thank you. Councilwoman Ajmera?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I wanted to follow up on Mr. Winston's question that I think Deputy Patterson did address. I remember last year when we had an incident where there was a damage to the property itself, where residents were didn't have an option but to stay somewhere else outside. Did risk assessment end up paying for those damages? What is our existing policy around that?
So I can't speak exactly to risk management's policy, I know that they do an investigation and then they make a determination on whether the damages are going to be taken care of. I believe I'm familiar with the one you're talking about because I was out there on that search warrant. I can tell you that if a residence is damaged, if there's any kind of munitions that's deployed inside, that we have resources just from a CFPD side through some of our partnerships that we have in the community, that we can get a hotel room or we can get a temporary residence for those individuals if there is significant damage or that kind of thing to their residence. But that is something that we have taken upon ourselves as CFPD and partnering with our partners that we have to do that. But on the risk management side of the house, I can't speak to what their policy is on repairing damages and that kind of thing.
Yes, so I remember last year where we had a family who was displaced because of the activity that had taken place there when no one was there. And I understand that you provide alternative or an option to stay at the hotel, and I remember the family did not have. I think they were offered a hotel room, but that was too small because I think they were living in a 3-bedroom house. So I'm trying to understand if someone could explain, maybe Mr. Manager, what is our existing risk assessment policy, and if there is a damage done where a family has been displaced, and it was in the case last year, what happens? Are we covering full damage? Does our insurance cover it? I would like to get a better understanding of that.
Beck, you want to take that?
Can you mute us?
This is Victoria Johnson. I will take that back to look at what risk management does and what the policy currently is, and how do they disperse it over the damages or when they have to reload people and they're displaced, and whether or not, if a hotel is not big enough, what can they do differently, and take that back to get that answer for you, okay?
Yes, that would be great. And I think, this creates, now we are looking at affordable housing problem. We don't want to be in a business of displacing people. So I think it's important that we review that policy at our next committee meeting after, if currently our existing policy does not pay for the damages that was caused by our department. Thank you.
Yeah, Ms. Johnson, I assume we can get an answer to that question before the next meeting, right?
Yes.
Chief Patterson, what would you say as far as the timeline y'all are on with Campaign Zero to continue and or conclude the conversations around changes we do think we can make to our policy, or finding middle ground on some of the places where we're not getting any credit right now? When can this committee and the council expect further progress or the next update on this?
I think we're really at the tail end, Mr. Chair. I'm thinking by the next meeting, by your next committee meeting, Chief Jennings will be ready to report out, give a full report on where we're at with it.
That would be great. Before, I know Ms. Watlington has a question that's more broadly concerning violent crime in our community that she wants to raise. But before we move to that, I just want to double check that no one else has any additional questions for Chief Patterson on the warrant topic. I don't see any hands. So, Ms. Watlington, if you are, her screen's gone out. There she is. Ms. Watlington, I know you had a broader question on violent crime for Ms. Patterson to address.
Yes, back in January, I made a request that we begin, or at least include in every Safe Communities meeting, an update on violent crime. And when I say update, I mean, what are our metrics? Where are we year over year? And what do we see are the driving trends? And what are we doing about it? So that is my request. It doesn't have to be a long report, but I just want to understand that is top of mind, and that we recognize what support you all may need in that effort, and that we can be clear, that we can communicate back to our constituents what's going on.
Ms. Watlington, this is Victoria Johnson. We can provide reports to you with that, similar to the ones that Ms. Jackson does on a daily, on a weekly basis. But we can provide that to you outside of this meeting so all of councils can have it. So by the time you get to this meeting, we're working on and focusing on policy, and that way you'll have a trending of what's going on. Would that be acceptable?
So I appreciate the information that Ms. Jackson sends, and certainly want to continue that. But what I'm really wanting to get at, this is not just the metrics, but the mitigation plans. I want to know what we're doing actively, looking forward versus looking back. I want to know what insights we're turning into action. That's the root of what I'm asking for in this meeting. And so that I see as distinct and separate and additional value add than what we're getting today from Ms. Jackson, which has its own place. I have no issue with
No,
that.
I wasn't trying to say just what she's doing now. I am saying that actually creating something differently, so it will give you the metrics, and actually you'll have a trending to see exactly what you want to look at specifically to see how you can change it going forward, so we could be forward thinking instead of reactionary. That's what I'm talking about.
I'm open to it. I'm open to seeing what you have, and if that creates a situation where we no longer need to discuss it here,
Right.
then we'll have that discussion. But right now, I want to see it until we put something in place that would indicate that we don't need it.
So I will have Chief Jennings and probably his team actually sit down and actually quantify it and make sure they truly understand what you're looking for to make sure that we're meeting the needs of what you're asking for, and then we can determine how we would share that going forward in order to move forward. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Chief Patterson, did you want to add anything to that?
Certainly, yeah, we will get that, we can get that information. I know that City Council member Wanton did ask us for some information about our crime reduction unit, their strategies and the work that they're doing. We have that information, we have sent it over, and I don't know.
Yeah, Ms. Wallington,
It was sit-
I don't know if you were with us at literally the first minute or two of the meeting, but we did receive in our packet via email the answers to the CRU questions as well as the answers to the Family Justice Center questions, the answers from these Family Justice Center folks themselves, not yet our staff's feedback, but so just wanted to make sure you received that as well.
Okay, I'm on my iPad, so I can't go back to my email, but if it came sometime during this meeting, then thanks, I'll take a look at it.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else for the good of the committee? Our next meeting's April 6th, same time, same place. I see, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to know if we can get an update from CMPD regarding the hiring practices of minorities. I know I've spoken to Chief Jennings about a report of where the barriers are in the hiring process to increase the number of minorities that are hired. I know we're losing some in, background check and lie detector. And I know that you all are working on something to see if there are possible implicit biases in the testing. But I just wanted an update on where we are as far as increasing minority hiring. When I look at the report, the percentage of those that are hired as opposed to those that apply is very low. So can you, I think you were somewhat involved in that. Chief Patterson, can you give some update on where we are with that, please?
Yes, I was, Councilmember Johnson. When I was over our admin services, I've since transitioned to patrol and operation services. I don't have that information in front of me, but certainly we can put something together and get that over to you.
And Councilwoman Johnson, the hiring practices was discussed during, say, Charlotte, and we're currently looking at an RFP to actually dig deeper into that, and maybe that'll be able to address your concerns better of what you're asking for. So we haven't forgotten about it. It's just creating it as one of the components of, say, Charlotte to actually do that work.
Okay, yeah, if we can just give the committee just the percentages will be great, so they can see where we are and where we are now and the work that Safe Charlotte's doing and how we're planning to improve those numbers.
Okay, so,
Thank
thank you.
All right, great. So thank you, Ms. Johnson. April 6th, we will expect to get a more conclusive update from Chief Patterson on where we've landed and what opportunities there are for additional policy changes there. Hopefully before the next meeting, we can get some some data or information that's responsive to Ms. Watlington and Ms. Johnson's questions they just asked. And I think Victoria Johnson it's always very confusing running this meeting because we have a Victoria Johnson, a Renee Johnson, and a Victoria Watlington. So I need to come up with nicknames we can use for everybody because it gets very, very muddled sometimes. Victoria Johnson is going to bring us back some information around the policies that currently exist as it relates to damage to people's homes due to the execution of a warrant at their home, particularly if it ends up being, you know, a mistake or there was some sort of misinformation that led to that damage. And if there is not something better in place than maybe we think there is, can there be or could there be? So with that, I'll entertain a motion to close.
Second.
All
So
right.
moved.
Everybody who agrees, sign off, and appreciate everyone's time.
Thanks.
Thanks.